The wind came down from the mesa like a sigh from an old ghost, brushing across the cracked boards of Red Hollow's main street. Dust rose from the ground in lazy spirals, golden under the late sun, and clung to everything: storefronts, hitching posts, even the faded sign that read Longspur Saloon. The place looked like it was built from the bones of the desert itself, and it creaked just the same. That was the afternoon an old man rode in. He came slow, one hand on the reins, the other resting on the saddle horn. His horse was a gray with ribs like fence slats, and both looked like they'd been through a few too many winters. The man's duster was torn at the hem, his hat sagged from years of sun, and his boots were ghosted with dust. Folks along the boardwalk paused their talk, just long enough to glance his way, the way townspeople do when a stranger looks like a relic from a time they'd rather forget. No one recognized him, not yet. He rode to the hitching post outside the saloon, dismounted slow, and tied off the reins with fingers that trembled just a little. Then he straightened his back, and for a moment, the light caught his eyes, gray, steady, unreadable. When he pushed through the saloon doors, the room barely stirred. The air inside was heavy with whiskey and sweat. A piano plinked off in one corner, off-tempo but determined, and the murmur of card games filled the space between. A few miners hunched over their drinks. Two ranch hands argued soft about the coming cattle drive. Behind the counter, a barkeep with a walrus mustache polished a glass and gave the old man the kind of look that measured how much money he might have left. Elias Crow didn't order a drink right away. He just took a seat near the wall, where he could see the door and the mirrors behind the bar. He sat there quiet as dust, his hands folded on the table in front of him. If anyone had paid closer attention, they might have noticed the shape under his coat, the old Colt Peacemaker resting easy against his ribs, worn smooth from a lifetime of use. But in Red Hollow, people didn't look for danger in wrinkles. A group of young cowpokes at the bar started talking louder once they noticed him. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, with a black vest and a mean grin, turned halfway around and said, "Well, look here, boys. The undertaker must be on holiday. He left one walking." Laughter rippled through the saloon. The piano player hesitated on a note, then kept playing, softer now. Elias didn't answer. He lifted his glass when the barkeep finally set whiskey in front of him and took a slow sip. His hands were steady now. The young man pushed away from the bar and sauntered over. His spurs jingled sharp on the floorboards. "You hear me, old-timer?" he said, grinning wide. "Ain't polite to ignore a man when he's talking." Still no answer. "What's the matter?" the man jeered. "Tongue dry as your bones." The saloon started to pay attention. Heads turned. Cards stopped shuffling. The sound of whiskey pouring seemed suddenly too loud. That was Jesse Talone, son of a ranch thief, quick with a revolver, quicker with his mouth. He was the kind of man who built a name not by fighting battles, but by picking easy ones. Red Hollow had seen his kind before. The sheriff let him roam so long as the trouble stayed small. Jesse leaned closer, squinting at the old man's weathered face. "You riding alone, Gramps? Or did your shadow run off, for you made it to town?" A few chuckles followed from his gang near the bar. Elias set down his glass and met Jesse's eyes for the first time. The room seemed to still in that moment. The piano went quiet. The wind outside stopped at the door. Those gray eyes didn't blink, didn't flinch. They looked through Jesse, not at him. Something cold passed between them, something ancient, like the hush before lightning splits a black sky. The old man finally spoke, voice low and calm as the desert before dawn. "Boy," he said, "you ought to learn what silence means." The way he said it made the hair rise on the back of every neck nearby. It wasn't the words, it was the tone, the kind that sounded like it had already buried men before. Jesse laughed too loud, brushing off the shiver that went through the room. "Silence. I'll give you silence." He grabbed the whiskey glass off Elias's table and flung it against the wall. The glass shattered, liquor dripping down the boards. Elias didn't move, didn't reach for his gun, didn't even blink. He just stared, the same quiet weight in his gaze. That's when the sheriff stepped in from the doorway. Sam Calder, a tall man in a dusty badge, his eyes hard but tired. He'd been sheriff long enough to know when a storm was forming. "That's enough, Jesse," he said, voice cutting across the room. "Sit down. I don't want to see no blood in here today." Jesse shrugged, still smiling. "Ain't no blood, Sheriff. Just having a talk with the old relic." The sheriff's hand drifted toward his holster. "I said sit." For a long moment, Jesse held Elias's stare. Then, with a mocking grin, he tipped his hat low and turned away. "You hear that, old-timer? The law says you live another day. Lucky you." He walked back to his men, laughter trailing behind him like the tail of a snake. The piano player started again, hesitant notes filling the silence. The sheriff approached Elias's table. "Don't mind him," he said quietly. "That boy's got more mouth than sense." Elias nodded once. "He's got more to lose than he knows." The sheriff studied him, that name echoing faintly in the back of his memory. Crow. He'd heard it somewhere years ago, maybe in the reports of a massacre down south, where one man was said to have dropped 8 guns in 8 seconds. But this couldn't be him. That man was long dead, or so they said. "Don't go bringing trouble, old-timer," the sheriff warned softly. Red Hollow's had its fill. Elias gave a small, tired smile. "So have I." The sheriff nodded and stepped away, leaving the old cowboy alone with his silence. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying with it the faint creak of the town's sign and the rattle of loose shingles. The horizon burned red as the sun sank behind the buttes, shadows stretching long across the street. Elias rose, placed a few coins on the table, and headed for the door. As he pushed through it, the saloon chatter resumed behind him, but it felt thinner now, uneasy. The piano stumbled on a wrong note and stopped again. Out on the boardwalk, he stood for a moment, breathing in the cooling air. His gaze drifted down the empty road, toward the livery stable, the general store, the church spire half leaning in the distance. He'd been through 100 towns like this one, each with the same smell of dust and whiskey, the same laughter that died when the shooting started. He reached inside his coat and pulled out something small, an old silver coin, rubbed smooth. He turned it between his fingers, then slipped it back into his pocket. Behind him, laughter broke out again from the saloon, Jesse's voice, loud and careless, mocking him from afar. Elias adjusted his hat and started walking toward the stable. His boots scuffed the planks softly. He didn't look back, but those who watched from behind the glass saw something in the way he walked, something steady, deliberate, like a man who had seen more death than the rest of them could imagine. By nightfall, Red Hollow had changed. The same people who had laughed at the old cowboy now whispered his name in half-belief, as if afraid he might hear. The saloon's chatter had turned cautious, the card games quieter, the laughter forced. From the corner of the bar, someone muttered at first, "He used to ride with the Reaper posse." The words carried, low and nervous, through the smoke and lamplight. The Reaper posse. Every man in Red Hollow knew the legend. 25 years back, they rode across Arizona territory, hired guns and bounty men who never missed. They didn't bring in prisoners, they brought silence. And at the center of it all was one name that town still spoke like a ghost story, Elias Crow. Nobody had seen him in decades. Folks said he died in a canyon shootout or disappeared into the mountains. Others said he'd walked away, too tired of killing to keep the blood off his hands. But now, a gray-haired stranger had walked into town with that same stillness in his eyes, and it didn't take long for rumor to find its shape. At the far end of the saloon, Sheriff Sam Calder nursed a glass of coffee gone cold. He'd heard the whispers too, but he kept his face unreadable. He knew names like Elias Crow came with history, long, hard, and paid for in graves. Outside, the wind turned colder. At the edge of town, Elias sat in the dim glow of a lantern inside a narrow stable room. The horse beside him shifted, snorted, then went still again. On the table before him lay the revolver, his old Colt .45, the steel worn smooth by time. He'd taken it apart piece by piece, laying each one out with reverence. The click of metal against wood echoed softly, the sound of a memory unburied. His fingers moved slowly but surely, wiping each part clean, the motions familiar, muscle deep. Dust drifted in the lamplight, and his reflection shimmered faintly in the gunmetal. An old man's face, eyes hollowed by miles and ghosts. He paused once, thumb brushing the cylinder, and for a moment, the smell of gun oil and candle wax carried him backward through time. Silver Gulch. 25 years ago. The sky had been black with smoke that day. Gunfire cracked across the valley, echoing off canyon walls, and the earth itself seemed to bleed dust. The Reaper posse rode in on orders from a mining company. "Clear the camp," they'd said. But the miners hadn't left quietly. They'd fought back, desperate men with nothing but rifles and rage. Elias remembered it all, the thunder of hooves, the screams that turned to silence, the way sunlight glared off rifle barrels until the whole place looked like it was burning gold. He'd been at the front, young and sure, firing fast, each shot clean. He'd been proud of his precision then, until the moment the bullet he sent down range found the wrong heart. He still saw her sometimes, his wife, Mara, standing in the chaos, her shawl whipping in the wind, their son clutching her skirt. She'd come looking for him, not knowing he was already there, caught in the fight. He turned at the sound of her voice, too slow to stop the shot that took her down. Afterward, he buried them both under a single cedar and rode into the desert without a word. The Reaper posse disbanded within a month. Nobody ever saw Elias Crow again. Until now. The lantern flickered, snapping him back to the present. He set the gun together with calm precision, spinning the cylinder once, listening to the familiar rhythm. Then he blew out the flame and sat there in the dark, the weight of years pressing against his chest. In the distance, faint laughter drifted on the wind. Jesse Talone and his gang. They'd been prowling the town since sundown, half drunk and looking for amusement. Someone said they'd carved their initials into the church door. Someone else swore they'd thrown stones through the general store window. Red Hollow was too scared to stop them and too small to fight back. Jesse strutted through the main street like a rooster, boots ringing on the boards. "Where's the sheriff?" he shouted. "Or did the law go to bed with the old man's ghost?" His gang laughed, the sound cutting through the cool air. They fired a pistol into the night, the shot echoing against the canyon rim. Sheriff Calder came out of his office, with his hand resting on his revolver. "That's enough," he said, voice low but hard. "Holster your guns and head home." Jesse grinned, turning to his men. "Hear that, boys? The sheriff's gonna tuck us in." "Don't test me, Talone." Jesse stepped closer, eyes glinting. "Why you protecting that old drifter anyway? You know what he is, don't you? Man like that don't just wander in by accident." The sheriff didn't answer. Jesse smirked. "Thought so." He turned, spat in the dirt. "Tell him to sleep light. I might drop by come morning. See if the Reaper still knows how to draw." Calder's voice was quiet. "If you're smart, Jesse, you'll be gone before dawn." Jesse tipped his hat, all mock respect. "Smart ain't what got me this far, Sheriff." He laughed and walked off into the dark, his men trailing behind. The sheriff watched until the sound of boots and laughter faded into the wind. Then he looked down the street toward the stable. The lamp was dark now. For a long moment, he stood there, the memory of that name, Elias Crow, pressing at the edge of his thoughts like an old scar. In the stable, Elias hadn't moved. The night pressed close, heavy and silent, the kind that carries its own kind of warning. He sat on the cot, revolver resting in his lap, thumb tracing the pattern on the worn grip. Every sound outside, the whisper of wind, the scrape of a horse shifting, seemed sharper, closer. He thought of his wife's face again, the way her eyes had looked just before the shot, the way the world had gone so quiet afterward. He'd spent half his life running from that silence, but it had followed him everywhere, faithful as a shadow. Some men grow old and forget what they were. Elias hadn't been given that mercy. He opened the gun, checked each round, then set it aside. From his saddlebag, he drew out a small piece of folded paper, creased from years of being opened and refolded. On it, in a fading hand, was a single line: "For every life taken, another debt to live." He'd written it the day he buried them. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer that wasn't quite forgiveness. Outside, the wind shifted. The sound of hooves drifted faintly through the dark, light, quick, circling the edge of town. He knew that rhythm. Drunk men on restless horses. Trouble looking for itself. He rose slowly, slipped the revolver into his holster, and blew out what little remained of the candle. The darkness wrapped around him, but his movements were calm, deliberate, like a man preparing for something he'd already lived 100 times before. At the far end of Red Hollow, Jesse and his gang rode past the church again. One of them fired a shot into the sky. Another hooped loud enough to wake half the town. A dog barked. Somewhere a window slammed. They laughed and kept riding, kicking up dust and noise. When they passed the saloon, Jesse reined in his horse. "You think the old man's asleep?" he asked. His second-in-command, a lean man with a scarred lip, shrugged. "Don't know. Don't care." Jesse grinned. "Reckon he could use a wake-up call." He swung his pistol around and fired once into the sky. The shot cracked through the night like thunder. The sound echoed through the streets, bouncing off the walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Lights flickered on behind curtains. The sheriff stepped onto his porch, hand on his gun, eyes hard. The fire started just before dawn. Quiet at first, a flicker under the stable roof, orange light twisting through cracks like a snake testing the air. Then came the roar, sudden and alive, swallowing the dry wood in seconds. Horses screamed inside, thrashing against their stalls, their panic echoing down Red Hollow's silent street. By the time the first shout rang out, "Fire! Fire at the livery!" The roof was already collapsing. Sheriff Calder ran barefoot into the cold, his badge glinting in the half-dark, the smell of smoke choking the air. He could hear one of his horses screaming inside. A ranch hand, young and foolish, rushed in with a bucket before anyone could stop him. The next thing they heard was the crack of timber and a scream that cut through every man's spine. The sheriff fell to his knees in the dirt, face lit by orange light, helpless as the flames took everything. From the edge of town, Elias watched. He'd been awake before it started, the way men who've lived by danger never truly sleep. He saw the first tongues of fire lick the horizon, heard the horses panic, smelled the smoke curling through the night air. His eyes stayed fixed, unreadable. By the time he reached the stable, the sheriff was on his feet again, shouting for buckets, ropes, anything. Elias helped cut loose the horses that could still be saved. His hands moved with the same calm precision as when he'd cleaned his gun. When a burning beam fell near him, he didn't flinch. He only pulled the sheriff away and said in that low voice of his, "They did this on purpose." Calder didn't answer, but his face said it all. There were no lightning storms that night, no accidents, only men mean enough to set fire to another man's home. As the town gathered in the cold, women holding their children, men standing in stunned silence, the crackle of the fire was the only sound. Then someone noticed tracks in the dirt, fresh horse prints heading out toward the ridge. Jesse Talon and his gang were gone. Elias turned toward the dark horizon, jaw tight. The sheriff followed his gaze. "He'll come back," Calder said, half to himself. Elias's tone was quiet but heavy as stone. "No, he's waiting for me to come to him." The words hung in the air, heavy as gun smoke. When dawn crept up, it came blood-red, lighting the smoke that drifted over the ruins of the stable. The town looked like it was still burning, and through that haze, shapes began to move on the ridge, riders, 5 of them, silhouettes against the rising sun. Jesse Talon was up there, his gang spread wide like wolves, rifles slung loose, laughter carrying down with the wind. From the street below, Elias stepped out of the stable ruins, dust clinging to his coat. He moved slow, steady, like the earth itself was giving way to his rhythm. His hat brim shadowed his face, the Colt at his side shining faintly with the light of the new day. His coat flapped open in the wind, and behind him the last flames hissed and died. The sheriff saw him and called out, "Elias, don't do this alone." Elias didn't look back. "Ain't alone," he said. "The dead ride with me." He kept walking. The street stretched ahead like a noose. Every window shuttered, every breath in town held. The church bell didn't ring. Even the air seemed to wait. The first sun rays broke through the dust, slicing across the town in long golden lines. At the far end, Jesse and his gang rode down slow, their shadows long and sharp across the dirt. Jesse's grin was wide beneath his hat. He called out as he came closer, "You look smaller in daylight, old man." Elias stopped in the center of the street. The light caught the side of his face, lined, scarred, half hidden by shadow. He said nothing. "You think you scare me?" Jesse laughed, spreading his arms. "You're a ghost, Crow. That's what they say. And ghosts don't bleed." Elias lifted his head just enough for his voice to carry. "Ghosts don't miss." The words stopped Jesse's grin cold. For a second, nobody moved. The world shrank to the creak of saddle leather and the slow flap of a torn sign above the saloon. Then a bird lifted off from the roof, startled by something unseen. The movement broke the stillness. Jesse went for his gun. The first shot cracked like thunder, echoing off the canyon walls. No one saw Elias draw. One heartbeat he stood still. The next, smoke curled from his barrel. Jesse's hand froze halfway to his holster, a bullet burning through his shoulder. He fell from his horse with a curse. The rest of the gang shouted, scrambling for cover, but Elias was already moving. He didn't run. He walked. Each shot came measured, deliberate, one breath, one pull, one body falling into the dust. His coat swung with each step, the light glinting off the steel in his hand. The sheriff, crouched behind a wagon, could hardly follow the rhythm. The shots weren't wild like most gunfights. There was music in them, precision born from decades of silence. Each man dropped before he could fire twice. Smoke drifted across the street, curling around Elias like fog. His boots stirred the dust where men had fallen. The echoes of gunfire faded into a long, aching quiet. Only one man still breathed, Jesse, crawling backward, hand clutching his bleeding arm. His hat lay crushed in the dirt beside him. He looked up at Elias, disbelief cutting through the pain. "You ain't human," he rasped. Elias stopped a few feet away, gun still in his hand. The morning light caught the gray in his beard, the old scars along his neck. "No," he said softly. "Just what men make of themselves when they stop caring who dies." Jesse's breath came ragged. You were supposed to be dead." Elias looked down at him, eyes colder than the steel in his hand. "I was." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he holstered the revolver and turned away. "You're lucky, boy," he said over his shoulder. "The ghosts are done with you." He started walking back toward the center of town. Behind him, the sheriff approached slowly, revolver drawn but unnecessary now. "It's over," Calder said, voice low. Elias didn't answer. He just stood in the street as the sun broke fully over the ridge, painting the smoke gold. The firelight and dawn mixed until it looked like the world itself was burning. When he finally spoke, his words carried through the still air. "I told him silence meant something." The sheriff looked at the bodies strewn across the dirt, the gang that had ruled the town now lying quiet as the graveyard beyond. "You didn't have to do this alone," he said softly. Elias's gaze stayed on the horizon. "Wasn't alone," he murmured again. "She was here." Calder frowned, not understanding, but Elias didn't explain. His eyes were far away, lost in a place where the fire and dust met the sky. From the saloon porch, townsfolk began to emerge, faces pale, eyes wide. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind pushing through the empty street, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke and gunpowder. Elias walked past them without a word, his boots slow, deliberate, the echo of each step the only heartbeat left in Red Hollow. Behind him, Jesse stirred one last time, tried to lift his pistol, but the sheriff was there first. A warning shot hit the dirt near his hand. "Stay down," Calder said. Jesse obeyed, eyes wide with fear now where arrogance had been. He looked toward the figure walking away and shivered. "What the hell was he?" he whispered. When the gun smoke thinned and the dust began to settle, Red Hollow was as still as a held breath. The dawn light had spread across the street, pale and gold, touching the fallen bodies like a reluctant confession. The air smelled of gunpowder, burnt wood, and the faint sweetness of blood. Every window in town was cracked open just enough for someone to look out and witness what was left of their fear. Jesse Talon lay half-conscious in the dirt, his face turned toward the light. His right arm was limp, blood slick across his sleeve where the bullet had torn through. He blinked at the brightness, dazed, unable to piece together how quickly his world had vanished. Around him, The men who'd followed him so eagerly into the fire were scattered in silence, their bravado gone with the night. Elias Crow stood a few paces away, smoke still rising from the muzzle of his revolver. His breath came slow, steady, as if even his lungs had learned to obey discipline. For a long moment, he didn't move. The wind caught his coat and carried the smell of ash past him, toward the church and beyond. Behind his eyes, something deep and tired shifted, like a man waking from a long dream he hadn't asked to dream. The sheriff came down from the porch, hat in hand. He didn't say anything at first. The two men just looked at each other, one whose legend had died long ago, and another who had just learned it was still alive. Finally, Elias turned and started walking toward the saloon. His boots scuffed through the dust, the rhythm slow and sure. He reached the wooden steps, paused, and without ceremony, set his revolver down on the top step. The metal caught the morning light and shone dull, a thing that had finally done enough. "Justice is done," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the still air. "Don't ask me to stay." The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He knew the kind of man who lived for peace, but was only ever followed by ghosts. "You won't have to tell me twice," Calder said softly. Elias gave him a small nod, almost grateful, then turned his gaze toward the horizon beyond the town. The sky was opening up now, streaked with rose and amber, the kind of light that makes men believe they might still be forgiven. Behind them, Jesse coughed weakly, his pride bleeding out faster than his blood. Who are you?" he managed to whisper, his voice cracked, desperate. Elias didn't turn. The sheriff looked down at Jesse, his shadow long across the boy's face. "You don't know," Calder said. "That's Elias Crow, the Reaper of Silver Gulch." The word seemed to hang in the air, heavy as judgment. Jesse's eyes widened. He tried to speak, but the sound that came out was small, like wind slipping through the cracks of an old barn. Then his head dropped back into the dirt, and he said nothing more. The sheriff looked toward the saloon where the revolver sat, then back at Elias, who was already walking away. "Where will you go?" he asked. Elias didn't slow his step. "Don't matter. World's smaller than it used to be." He crossed the street, each step measured and quiet, until he reached the edge of town, where the land opened up into endless desert. There his horse waited, gray, patient, with eyes that had seen just as much of the world's cruelty as its master. Elias rested his hand on its neck, the gesture gentle, almost human. But before mounting, he turned toward the small rise beyond the churchyard, where the grave markers stood crooked in the wind. The earth there was hard and dry, the crosses hand-carved from cedar. He walked that way slowly, the sound of his boots fading until only the breeze spoke. At the far corner of the graveyard stood a cross smaller than the rest, weathered and leaning. A faded ribbon, once red, now brown with time, hung from it, fluttering faintly. Elias stopped there. His face softened in the light, and his shoulders dropped as if a long-carried weight had finally shifted. He knelt beside the grave, removed his hat, and set it down in the dirt. For a moment, he just stared at the name carved into the wood. The letters were nearly gone, worn down by wind and years, but he didn't need to read them. He could still hear her voice when the wind passed through the grass, soft, steady, the way it used to sound when she'd say his name before dawn. "Didn't think I'd make it this far," he murmured. His hand brushed over the ribbon, but I kept my word. "No more running." He looked out toward the burning edge of the sky. "I'm sorry it took so long." A tear traced a pale line through the dust on his cheek. He let it fall, unashamed, then rose to his feet. For a long while, he stood there motionless, the morning wind tugging at his coat, the world quiet except for the whisper of grass and the distant crackle of dying embers from the stable. When he finally spoke again, his words were barely louder than breath. "I'll be seeing you soon, darling. Just got a little more road to walk." He placed his hand on the cross one last time, then turned and walked back toward his horse. The sun had climbed higher now, casting long, golden rays that stretched across the desert floor. He mounted up slowly, the leather creaking beneath him, then looked once more toward Red Hollow. The town was waking. People stepped into the streets, cautious, silent, as if unsure whether the danger had truly passed. They watched him in awe, whispering his name as if afraid to speak it too loud. The Reaper. The man who'd vanished. The man who'd come back only when evil needed killing. Elias tipped his hat, the faintest gesture of farewell, then turned the horse toward the open plains. The sheriff stood in the middle of the road, watching him go. The dust kicked up by the horse's hooves caught the sunlight and turned to gold. For a long while, Calder didn't move. When one of the townsmen came up beside him and said, "He'll be back, won't he?" The sheriff shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Men like that don't come back. They just fade into legend." Out on the plains, Elias rode slow, letting the silence settle. The land stretched out before him, vast and empty, the horizon a thin line between the living and the gone. The morning air was sharp and clean. Somewhere far off, coyotes called to one another, their voices thin and mournful. He thought about how it all looked. The town behind him, the fire reduced to ash, the graves resting in quiet peace. Maybe for the first time in years, he'd done something right. Not for glory, not for vengeance, just for the simple reason that right was all that was left. As he rode, the light changed. The sun burned hotter, the desert shifting colors like an ocean of dust and gold. His shadow followed him long and lean across the sand. It looked almost like there were two riders instead of one. He smiled faintly at that, at the thought that maybe he wasn't riding alone after all. By midday, Red Hollow was no more than a shimmer in the distance. The world ahead was open, endless, and waiting. He didn't know where the road led, and it didn't matter. Some journeys weren't about destinations. They were about finally having the courage to move on. Somewhere behind him, a bell rang from the church, a slow, solemn toll marking the dead. It carried on the wind, following him for miles, until it faded into the hum of the earth itself. Elias Crow rode on, his figure growing smaller against the blinding light. Dust swirled around him in soft spirals, and the horizon seemed to open its arms wide, ready to take him in.